Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Remote Workforce Landmines to Avoid. I'm Mike Agresti, tax partner at LSL, and we're glad you joined us today. Many of you are running some form of remote in-person workforce model, and we wanted to make sure you're aware of things to look out for. We've asked our friends at Payne Fears law firm to share their knowledge on this topic with you today. Before we get started, I'll hand it over to Jill to introduce our speakers and go over a few quick housekeeping items.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. Okay, just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded and you'll receive the recording link, slides, and a link to a similar webinar Payne Fears recently presented. So be on the lookout in your inbox for all of those things later today. This webinar will run 50 minutes with a 10-minute question and answer period at the end. If you have a question for the presenters, please put it in the Q&A box located in your Zoom toolbar. To find the Zoom toolbar, go ahead and hover your cursor over the top or the bottom of your screen, and you should see a toolbar pop up. The Q&A box is located next to the participants box. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters from Payne Fears LLP. Jeff Brown defends employers against class actions and individual cases brought under California and federal employment laws. He has significant experience in traditional labor matters and regularly handles union representation elections, unfair labor practice proceedings, labor arbitrations, and collective bargaining. Jeff brings a strong track record of litigation wins at every level in every forum to his engagements. He currently serves as the managing partner of the firm's Orange County office. Sharon Shaoulian handles a variety of labor and employment matters, including assisting clients with employee engagements and retention, as well as workforce reductions. She works with clients to draft employee handbooks and personnel policies, employment contracts, independent contractor agreements, and separation agreements. She also defends businesses against employee lawsuits, representing and advising employers in a variety of matters, including harassment, discrimination, retaliation, wrongful termination, and wage and hour disputes. All right, I'd like to hand it over to our presenters.
Great, good morning. Thank you for the introductory notes, Sarah, and thank you everybody for joining us. So I want to spend a couple minutes before we jump into the specifics and just talk about the overall theme or agenda for today. We've got 6 categories really that we've sort of used as buckets of the various problems that come up with remote working. And I'm going to cut to the chase right now and just tell you the theme of today's presentation, which is very, very simple. It's this: working from home is still working. Okay, working from home is still working. And that sounds really obvious, but about a year ago, when we were all going through the transition of pulling people out of the office and setting them up at home, it wasn't obvious. And I can tell you, I've got clients now, and I've got friends, and I've got people in my own firm who still don't fully understand that. And this is what I mean. If you are a non-exempt employee, meaning someone who's got to comply with timekeeping, the overtime, the meal period, all the other rules and regulations that make California so wonderful. A lot of those people, I believe, when they went into a work from home or remote working schedule, took it to mean some kind of flex time, where you could get up, have breakfast, maybe check emails for an hour, go drop your kids off at school, knock off a couple more hours, go work out, come back, work a couple more hours, etc. Basically just have a flexible schedule. And I'm all for that. I love that. I want people to be happy in their lives. But the state of California has a very, very different idea. They did not provide relief from any of the various workplace regulations that govern timekeeping, meal periods, anything like that. Those are still in effect. You don't get a special COVID pass on those things. So everybody that is at home or remote is still subject to the same rules that they always were. And that's why when you look at these 6 items on the agenda, there's nothing new here. These are all things that your lawyers have been telling you about for years and telling you that you've got to have strong policies for. And we're going to focus on that a lot throughout the next hour, the way that you can defend yourself basically by creating policies and pushing them out. The problem, of course, is that you may have a small issue with timekeeping and compliance when everybody's at work, but when they're at home, it's a bigger issue. We're going to talk about timekeeping in a second, but I'm convinced through conversations I've had that we've got people who are logged in. Their employer thinks they're clocked in and working, and they're not. They're binge watching Sons of Anarchy, okay? And at the end of the day, even worse from a legal standpoint, they're clocked out. We think they're off duty, but they're sitting there writing emails, they're working on documents, they're conducting work to make up for the time that they spent watching TV earlier. And that's where you're going to get your class action exposure in liability is when they're working off the clock. So pretty much every problem that you have monitoring your workforce at the office is worse now when they're at home. And so that's the theme here. Working from home is still working, and we're going to talk about ways that you can convince everybody of that and convince them of the seriousness of your policies. So with that, let's move forward to the first of our specific issues. We want to talk about timekeeping, meal and rest breaks, overtime, and I'll throw off the clock in there. As was mentioned, I do a lot of work defending employers from class actions or private attorney general cases in California. This topic here is what fuels maybe 80% of those. And so our first specific issue here is timekeeping landmines, okay? And the risk here, we've got non-exempt employees, and let me clarify for a second. 80% of what we're going to be talking about is going to refer to non-exempt employees. If you've got people who are properly exempt and on salary, a lot of these things aren't an issue. Some are, but for the most part, we're going to focus on your non-exempt employees, meaning the people who need to punch in, punch out, make time and a half if they work overtime, etc. Okay. Our problem here when we send everybody home is that they may perform their job duties without recording all their time. That's called an off the clock violation if somebody's working while they're not clocked in. And the practical way it comes up, let's say you're working on a document. The document has a history. If it's WordPerfect or Word, it's going to have a document history. If you send an email, the email has a timestamp on it, okay? If you have a time card or a time record that says you're working from 9 to 6 with a 1 hour meal period, but I've got emails that I can look at and see they were sent at 10 o'clock, or I've got a document that says it was edited at 1 o'clock in the morning, I now have an off the clock problem. That employee has evidence that he or she was working at 1 in the morning or at 10 at night, and yet they didn't get paid for it. And the time records are inaccurate, but they're going to say that I, as the employer, had noticed that they were working outside of their regular work hours, and I should have paid them for it. And this is what drives class actions, because it's very, very simple for an employee to get discovery into all those documents, all those emails, look at the timestamps, create a spreadsheet, and show a massive amount of liability for people working off the clock. Some of you are going to be familiar with this because employees do it in an office setting all the time. They'll log out, but then they'll keep on working on something. But when they're home, we can't walk up and down the hallway and see it. How do we manage this? Policies, okay? It's very, very simple. We need to flow out specific policies and make it clear that they apply to people working at home. Number one, we need a policy that sets specific hours, meaning regular shifts. This is what I was talking about earlier. We cannot have a non-exempt employee work 2 hours here, 4 hours there, another 2 hours here. They need to be in a shift, and the shift needs to have a start time, needs to have an end time, and if it's over 5 hours, we're going to need to have time for a meal period where they can punch out and then punch back in. If you impose this regular shift, that's going to wipe out a huge percentage of your potential problems, because at a glance, you can look and see if somebody's working outside those hours. You can call them, you can email them, you can have a meeting for everybody on Teams, whatever you want to do, and tell them, look, we mean it, okay? Just because you're working from home, you still have a shift. You're still a 9 to 6 with an hour in the middle person. And so I would strongly recommend, do not think this is flex time. This is just working from home. Keep everybody on specific shifts. Can you vary it so that maybe somebody can start at 8 instead of 9, or get off at 4 instead of 5 to deal with childcare or, you know, a noisy house or whatever? Sure, absolutely. We don't have to keep the exact same shift we always had. But as a practical matter, the more regular, the better you are. The second bullet point there is a clear prohibition of working outside of the set hours. A lot of employees don't understand this. They think that you should be happy if they're working outside of their hours. You should be happy if they're so dedicated to their job that they always check their emails. Unfortunately, the state of California says we have to pay them for that. And it can say that they're actually reporting to work. There's case law that says if an employee checks his email or calls into a line to see if they're scheduled for an on-call shift, that is, quote, reporting to work, which means a 2-hour pay entitlement. Okay, so it's not really good for us if the employees are so diligent that they're working outside of their hours. And we need a clear prohibition in that policy that they sign where they acknowledge, you know, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but we do not want you working outside of your clocked in hours. Third bullet point, we want to find the problem before it becomes big, right? If we've got somebody who they do 15 minutes of work, I'd rather pay them the 15 minutes and tell them to knock it off than let it slide for 9 months and then have a class action because it piled up and turned into a real problem. So we need to instruct people, not only are they not supposed to work outside of the hours, but if they do, if for some reason there's an emergency, it is an on-call situation, they just open up their mailbox and type an email, I want them logging that time. Okay, and I won't go too far into this, but basically under California law, we as the employer have a burden to keep accurate time records. And if an employee can show that our time records are not accurate, the result is that the courts are instructed to take the employee's word for how much time they worked. So if you've got somebody who's supposed to be working 8-hour shifts, but they can prove that we didn't really have an accurate timekeeping record, they can come in and testify they worked 10, 11, 12 hours, and the court has to believe it. Now we have to disprove it and go the other way. Well, when everybody's reporting into the office, it's easy, right? I can look at security logs. I can look at video cameras on the entry and exit to the building. I can have coworkers testify. But if somebody's sitting at home, I don't have any of that. I don't have any witness who can say, oh yeah, I saw them start at 9 instead of 8. I've got nothing, okay? So I need accurate records. And to the extent I'm not keeping accurate records now, I need to start, because that's going to be my only line of defense. And then the fourth point, implement electronic systems. We use Salesforce all the time. A lot of our clients use something like that, which is intended to log activity, but it also keeps a nice record of when somebody's working. We can have systems that make you log in and out of your computer. That's the best thing to do. Let me jump ahead a little bit. When somebody's working at home, we want to be providing them with the tools that they need. In other words, a home desktop setup, a laptop setup, whatever tools they need to keep working, we've got to provide it to them, okay? And that's going to come under the expenses that Sharon's going to talk about a little bit later. When we provide them with those tools, that's a great time for us to install appropriate devices that track when they're on or off. If somebody's got a dedicated work laptop, and we track when they log in at the start of the shift and when they log out at the end, that is a great way of bookending the day and preventing them from working off the clock. Okay, so all these things, they can be boiled down concretely into a remote work policy or a remote timekeeping policy. Kind of a general comment on policies. A lot of the advice we give day to day has to do with clarifying policies and expectations, whether it's meal periods, timekeeping, et cetera. A lot of companies aren't as up to speed as they should be on those policies, but it's difficult to roll something out of the blue because it makes employees start thinking, gee whiz, I didn't clock out for lunch yesterday. Everybody just kind of stopped working. Today, they're making me clock out for lunch. What changed? You know, and pretty soon they reach the conclusion that maybe I should go back and sue them for the 4 years that I didn't clock out for lunch. And so it's always awkward to roll out new policies mid-employment. Well, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? If you are now implementing a comprehensive work from home or remote work policy, that's a great time to put in good compliant meal and rest period and off the clock policies. Anything that you didn't have that you needed to polish up a little bit, now is a great time to do it, because we're going to make clear that those policies, those practices, those requirements, they're going to apply even after people come back from their remote work. Let's go to the next one here. So I've mentioned this a couple times. California is great, right? 49 states, we can trust people to eat lunch. California, we have to provide meal periods under a whole complicated system of timing. And that's the subject of another seminar probably, but boils down to very simple terms. If an employee is going to work more than 5 hours in a work period or a work day, we need to provide them with a 30-minute uninterrupted meal period. And we also need to provide them or authorize them to take a 10-minute rest break, which is on the clock, but they get one for every 4 hours or major fraction thereof. And that's the simplest way to put it. Most of you have probably developed compliant meal period policies under California law. A lot of clients will actually put a little summary of the policy at the bottom of their weekly timesheet, make people sign off that they've gotten all their breaks. And that's great. But again, if you don't have it, now's a great time to do it. If you do have it, we need to make clear that it applies at home. There has been a huge communication breakdown that we see when we talk to clients almost every day, where employees think that because they're working remotely, they don't need to follow the rules anymore. And that is simply not true. So once again, looking at these bullet points, we want to schedule regular meal periods. Can we be flexible in where they fall during the day? Sure, we can move them around, but we should have a recurring shift, okay, a recurring weekly arrangement of meal periods. Have the employee agree to that schedule. And that way, at a glance, we can look at their punches and see if they're messing with it, if they're working during lunch or not. We should make clear that it applies to people working from home. Again, I can't overstate how much confusion there is. They think they're off-site, so they're on their own time. We need to make clear meal policies apply to employees working from home. We need to remind them, okay, I'm gonna digress into litigation a little bit here. In order to get a class action certified, an employee typically has to show that the employer fell down on a class-wide or company-wide basis, either that we had an affirmatively illegal policy or that we had no policy at all to provide meal periods. Our number one piece of evidence is going to be a very clear policy saying you have to take meal periods. Our number two piece is going to be a paper trail showing that we would send emails, Outlook invites. We had tailgate meetings or all hands meetings where we reminded employees of the policy. It's very difficult for an employee to testify under oath that they didn't know that they could take lunch when I've got 5 signed pieces of paper from them and 2 more sign-in sheets at company meetings where we just hammered it in. So we want to create that evidence in advance that they've got to be reminded of it and provided with their meal periods. And then finally, we want them to sign their timekeeping documents. This is both for the off the clock side and the meal side. Every week, even if they're at home, we need something where they review their time for the week and sign off that it was accurate. Again, once we depose somebody and they're trying to say, I worked all this time and I didn't get paid for it, it's very hard for them to do that if we have their signature again and again and again on a timesheet. That falls by the wayside when people go home. Let's go to the next slide here. And last specific here is overtime. We talked about this a little bit with the off the clock, but there's also always an issue with overtime. As you know, California obligates us to pay 1.5 times a regular rate if people work over 8 in a day or 40 hours in a week. Okay, in most states, it's just a 40-hour week. California is daily. This is a huge problem when people are working from home, because when we trust people to go home and simply get the tasks done, it's pretty intuitive that they may say, well, I'm going to knock off early today for whatever reason, go watch the sunset, go fishing, whatever, and I'll make up for it tomorrow. And as long as I've got an average of 8 hours a day, it shouldn't really matter to anybody how much I work one day and how much I work another. Again, California thinks differently. There is a very specific process under California law for makeup time. And you can basically make up to 3 hours within the same work week, no more. And you've got to jump through some hoops and get it approved. And it is not just a blanket flex time rule. So employees do not get to flex their own time. If they do, you're going to be liable for it. How do you manage that? Well, once again, keep track of the time, make clear that pre-authorization still applies. I'm sure most of you require an employee to get authorization from a supervisor before incurring time and a half. And that still applies at home. And let them know you cannot move hours from one day to another. That is tantamount to time card falsification. You can't do it. They've got to log in and work regular set hours. Let's move to that summary slide. And just to wrap up, I'm going to start to sound like the broken record here, but the things we need to do to kill this liability is some sort of monitoring or observation mechanism in place, whether it's electronics on their computer, having them phone in, having them use timesheets, get some monitoring in place. Develop policies that perfect your overtime, your meal period, your off the clock rules, and make absolutely clear to your employees that those policies apply at home, when they're working from another state, they apply wherever. And last comment, again, not to get too deep in the weeds legally, you can have an employee who is based at your California facility, and if they have decided that during the pandemic they're going to go home to Nebraska for a few months, there is still an excellent chance that California law will apply. So no pass just because they're working really remotely. So that if there's any questions on those topics, go ahead and pop them into the Q&A box. But those are our initial thoughts on the timekeeping and wage and hour issues. I will now turn it over to Sharon, who will talk a little bit about another problem that we see at work, which is arguments that we are discriminating against employees, and how that gets even worse when we let half of them go home.
Thank you, Jeff. So our next topic is going to be non-discriminatory application of these processes and these decisions for employees that are going to be working from home, and how do we make sure that things are applied fairly for all of our employees, and employees feel that they are being treated fairly, that the decisions to allow them to either work from home or stay working at the site are being applied fairly, to make sure that we don't run into any issues down the line. So the first point is going to be kind of a general overview of what kind of trends we're seeing across the board. So a 2020 study that was conducted on the characteristics of individuals who can and cannot generally work from home is up here on the screen. So we're looking at the trends that we're seeing, and we're finding that more likely than not, those employees who are generally not able to be working at home are coming from lower income backgrounds where they might be a little bit less educated, lack a college degree, they're generally non-white, as well as a few other factors that are up here on the screen. So I want to start off by saying that these are some of the things that we should be aware of when we're coming up with those decisions to allow employees to work from home or not, and kind of be aware that there is disparity out there, and that we want to root our decisions very, very heavily on facts on the ground, what jobs can or can't be performed at home, and really look to those concrete factors and be aware, so we're not carrying out any accidental discrimination or insensitive decision making on that end. So in the center of the screen, we have some of the characteristics of jobs that can generally not be performed remotely. with a list right there. Generally, we're looking at jobs that require maybe heavy machinery. Employees just don't have those tools and equipments at home. Jobs where employees might be interfacing very heavily with clients or customers or consumers directly, and need to have that, their direct communication while they're at work, while they're on a site. So these are some of the factors that we might be looking to when making those decisions and when informing employees of why they might not be able to perform their work remotely, even if they really, really want to, which nowadays it's going to be really hard to get our employees to come, back to work or to, want to curb their impulse from wanting to go work at home. So we want to really root our reasoning behind very concrete business needs, which can be found right there on the screen. Our next slide is going to be about kind of the decisions that we want to look to, how we're going to allow work from home, and how to really ground that into business reasoning. So again, to hammer that point home, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas study found that white and Asian workers are much more likely to have the remote option over Black or Hispanic employees. So again, hammering that point home, we want to really be aware that there's a disparity out there, and to really drive the point home with employees that our decisions to allow or not allow work from home are rooted in concrete business reasoning. So some of the things that you should be considering are right there in the center. If your policy is being applied equally based on race, and there aren't any strange disparities there, if it's applied equally based on age, considering what employees of different backgrounds and different ages might be less comfortable with remote work, we want to have that interactive process open, but we want to make sure that we're applying our policies very equally across the board. And the third point up there is whether it's applied, how it's applied to employees that might have disabilities. So of course, when you have during regular times of non-remote work, even and before COVID, that interactive process and possible reasonable accommodations open to employees with disabilities, we want to make sure that that's carrying over for employees that are carrying out their work remotely. So having that dialogue open with your employees, making sure that for employees with disabilities who are working at home, whether they are being accommodated, if there are any further accommodations that they might need while they're at home, that process, that interactive process should be happening. Those questions should be asked and employees should be checked in with to make sure that they have everything that they need and they feel that they can carry out their work appropriately. So to sum up that point of the previous slides, we have, of course, a disparate treatment, which is the number one, the most direct type of discrimination that we could be seeing that we definitely want to avoid, and disparate impact, which would be unintentional discriminatory effect. So really rooting our reasoning and application of allowing work from home very fairly across the board and implementing that based on solid reasoning for the business needs. The last slide that we have here is going to be about a PwC 2020 study that asked employees what could help them be more productive while they were working remotely. So this is really crucial and really on par with the trends that we're seeing with what employees need to provide a productive day for themselves and a really solid work product. So greater flexibility in work hours, better hardware and equipment, clear rules that are establishing the times of when people are available to them, and help with managing their workloads. So if we're looking at the first point up there, greater flexibility in their work hours. 57% of executives are planning to provide this. That's huge, and that's showing a really different trend that's coming about, because we might be moving away from a more traditional 9 to 5, 9 to 6 block of time that everyone's really used to. But if we're seeing that employees are interested in that greater flexibility that Jeff talked about, as long as we're complying with California rules regarding meal and rest and overtime and making sure they're logging in their hours appropriately, not working strange hours off the clock or a weird 13-hour day, employees are really valuing that flexibility in managing their schedules. So checking in with your employees and seeing, when might be their peak hours for a schedule might be conducive to a really nice work environment and a really good work product there. The second point up there, better hardware and equipment. So we really want to make sure, obviously, that our employees have everything that they need when they're working from home, so that there aren't any blips with, my laptop's not working, I don't have the tools I need. We want to make sure that we can simulate the environment as best as we can. So we're taking out any variables or excuses or anything like that. So things are running really smooth. Third point, clear rules that establish the times when people are available. It's helpful to know when your coworkers are off the clock. Maybe someone starts earlier than you do, maybe they end later than you do or end earlier than you do. And it's nice to know when you need someone, if they're going to be available, if they're going to be reading your email. It helps you frame your day and it helps things, again, run smoothly. So maybe providing a snapshot of when colleagues are working, when their schedules might be, to help everything run a lot more cohesively. Last point up there, employees are really expressing an interest and need for help in managing their workloads. Unfortunately, we're only seeing that 43% of executives plan on providing this, which hopefully we're in that 43%. We definitely want to make sure that during this time that employees are working from home and a lot of people are feeling a little bit more isolated or a little bit on their own, our employees are able to come forward, talk about their workloads, say if they need more work, say if they need help divvying up that work, and making sure that we have a nice work-life balance so that, touching on some of Jeff's points, we can make sure that they're working at the times that they should be working, but that they're off the clock during the times that they should be off the clock, and that, their work life doesn't become their entire life while they're at home, but that they're giving a solid work product during the hours that they should be working.
And before we move on, I just want to make a comment in kind of a piece of practical advice on something that Sharon said. She mentioned there's two kinds of discrimination that the courts recognize. One's called disparate treatment. That's where I intentionally target somebody because of a protected characteristic and fire them, or in this case, don't allow them to work from home. I make them come in even though I know they don't want to. And obviously that can't be based on race, age, sex, disability status, any of the typical protected categories. I'm going to assume that if you're on this call, you are interested enough in legal management of your workforce that you're not doing that. You know better than to do that. So the dangerous thing here is the second one that Sharon mentioned, which is called disparate impact. And that's where we have a policy that looks neutral. Okay, and obviously, I'm going to assume you do not have a policy that says, hey, women get to work from home and men have to come in, or vice versa. So you've got a policy that looks neutral, and yet the outcomes aren't right. That's what that Bank of Dallas study showed. I was a little bit surprised until you start thinking about maybe what some of the business rationales are. And so on a disparate impact theory, what the EEOC does when they get a complaint, they go out to look for a disparate impact, they look at the ratio of positive outcomes in a majority group or a control group, and then they look at the ratio of positive outcomes in the protected category that the employer is accused of discriminating against. And they apply what they call the 4/5 rule. So if there's more than a 4 out of 5, or I guess a 20% difference between those ratios, then they're going to assume there's a systemic discrimination issue. And so that's an easy check. I'm sure a lot of you do it already with respect to promotions or pay equity audits. You're probably looking for violation of that rule as you look at your workforce in general. But now we've got to assume that the decision to make somebody come back to work, even though they've expressed a preference to stay at home and work, is going to be considered an adverse action. So you're going to want to look to see. And so picture, for example, a manufacturing facility where everybody on the assembly line is a man, and yet the entire finance department of 10 people are women. And we decided we're going to let the finance folks work at home because they're just on their computer anyway, and the assembly line people have to come in. Well, the EEOC will look at that right off the bat and say, you've got a problem here. You're discriminating against men. In this case, we have an obvious business-related defense. When the EEOC calls, what we don't want to say is, gee whiz, yeah, we get that, but that's because we trust the women to work at home, or that's because we think they have more childcare needs, so we're going to let them work at home, or something like that. No, you want to have a solid business presentation. We have an assembly line. We can't move the assembly line to people's houses, so those guys have to stay here. So just as you run your regular checks or monitoring across your workforce to look for these hidden unintended discriminatory effects, look at this also, because we are going to see lawsuits by employees who say, gee whiz, everybody else was allowed to stay home and they made me come into work and have a 2-hour commute because they singled me out or targeted me. So we do want to look for that. Jumping to my actual topic here, monitoring employees. When we're talking monitoring here, we're talking about looking at employee activity somehow. And this could be as simple when everybody was in my office, I'd just walk up and down the hallway every now and then and kind of see what people are doing. We can't do that when they're at home. So we tend to move to electronic monitoring systems. Let's bump to the next slide there, Sharon. And what we're doing here is okay, I'm assuming we're on the why would an employee want to monitor, or employer want to monitor an employee slide. There's a number of reasons. Okay, first of all, I talked about a whole bunch of situations in which we want to keep accurate time, and we're trying to keep and protect against off the clock work, protect against meal period issues, etc. And so that's one reason. And I talked about having people clock in, clock out, looking at their activity. So we want to see what they're doing to protect against a class action. Second point, you've all read about Colonial Pipeline, some other issues that have happened with hacking and ransomware. We want to maintain the integrity of our software. That can be as simple as making sure people don't click on executables. It might be making everybody work behind a firewall so that they cannot be exposed to anything that would cause harm to the network. Third point, we want to protect our intellectual property, including trade secrets. We don't want people downloading that. Fourth, just like the workplace, we want to make sure people are not downloading things that they should not, which would include not only improper material here, but anything that might be seen as harassing or discriminatory. And we want to ensure appropriate productivity levels. We want to see what people are doing. And so these are all reasons that we want to engage in some form of electronic monitoring. So what are the problems? Let's look at this legal landmines, electronic communications privacy slide. These are the various federal laws dealing with.
Okay.
I don't know what happened there, but
why don't you run through and take us to the finish line? How's that? Great, thank you.
Looks like Sharon was talking about reimbursement issues there. I'm not quite sure where she left off. So let me just go with the general rule here. And apologize if I'm reiterating something she said. Under California law, Section 2802 of the Labor Code, we need to reimburse employees for Sharon, you're back.
Yes, I am back.
Okay. I was just talking about 2802, but take it up where you left off.
Sure. So we want to make sure that we are reimbursing employees, but fortunately, these are only expenses that are incurred in direct consequence of the discharge of their duties. So a suggestion that we have for you is not only making sure that employees have all the supplies that they need to fulfill their duties, which is the typical things that we talked about: laptop, phone, pens, paper, everything, but providing a mechanism for getting those reimbursements to our employees, whether it's an upfront stipend system or a receipt and reimbursement system on the back end. So another general rule for us to really look to and follow is that employers are not required to reimburse work from home business expenses when the employee has the option to work remotely. But the rule does not apply when the employee doesn't have the option of going to the office and is required to work from home. So those expenses may be foreseeable and a clearly anticipated part of doing business at home. So we really want to consider that difference. Again, in the second part of the slide, we have some of the different costs that might be subject to reimbursement: cell phone, landline use, printing costs, any kind of software that employees might need while they're at home. That are things that we should really look to. So some of the more complicated and interesting situations for us, because we don't live in a very black and white world, obviously, and definitely not during COVID, that California courts have weighed in on that might be relevant to us are: the first point, employees that have an unlimited use phone plan. So like we talked about, costs that are purely personal are not going to be subject to reimbursement, but anything that is incurred in direct consequence to carrying out duties, that's going to be fair game for employers to reimburse. So when we're looking at something like an unlimited use phone plan, that's something that we're going to have to parse out what was a relevant and needed business expense and what was purely personal. So here we can see California courts have found that employers must still reimburse employees when they use their personal devices for work if the employer isn't providing either a separate device or a cellular plan that's just for their work. So a suggestion for this, again, like we said, either providing a stipend up front or on the back end through a receipt and reimbursement process of seeing, how much time, how many minutes, how many, what percentage was used for work expenses, work calls from their boss, from their supervisor, from their coworkers. A second point of interest, employees that are using home internet access when you're providing with them with a hotspot mobile device access or something like that. A court found that the employer didn't have to reimburse an employee for his home internet access just because the company provided the worker with access to a mobile hotspot. So even though the employee's home internet was faster, you're not going to be on the hook for something like that. If you're providing something comparable that's allowing them to carry out their duties, odds are employees are not going to be able to come back and say, well, I have a newer device, I have a better device, I have a faster device, and that should be reimbursed. It's not like they get to furnish their whole home and submit receipts for that. If you're providing comparable materials and things that are allowing them to carry out their duties. So in summary, at the bottom there, we have the considerations that employers should be thinking about when reimbursing employees. So number one, is the expense necessary? Do they need that to carry out their duties? Number two, how reasonable is it for the employee to be spending? Would a $300 laptop suffice? Do they need the $2,000 Mac? Something like that. And how should the expense be reimbursed? Whether it's stipend on the front end, up front, giving them X amount, or allowing them to submit receipts for reimbursal afterwards and reviewing that way. Our final point for me is going to be about disability accommodations and OSHA issues. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has made clear that working from home is a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. However, as of September 8th, 2020, the EOC guidance has stated that businesses are not going to be required to automatically allow remote work as a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act as the threat of COVID goes away. So we're starting to get a little bit more into that zone. So this is definitely a point of interest. So that is going to mean that whether remote work is going to be a reasonable accommodation is going to remain a very fact-specific determination on a case-by-case basis, and the regular ADA rules are going to apply, which includes medical documentation and all of that. So it's not like we're going to be in this zone forever where working from home is just going to be the gold standard of a reasonable accommodation always and forever as COVID starts to go away. Further guidance from the EEOC on this point, workers' ability to work remotely during COVID-19 is going to be very instructive and relevant in situations where that employee's request to work from home was denied before COVID-19. So we have some text here that's going to be provided for your further review. But the EEOC's remarks are really putting the burden on the employer to demonstrate that that employee's continued telework is impairing him or her from performing essential functions of their job. And it places the burden on the employer really to make that determination, whether they can continue doing so, whether their request should be granted. That period of working from home during COVID is really going to be a test for them. So it might be a way to stop employees from continuing remote work after COVID goes away. So employers are really going to have to establish that the essential job functions of the employee were stopped by the COVID precautions that were in place, either that the employer had to implement or chose to implement, and that continuing to allow those work duties to be halted or relaxed is going to place an undue hardship on the company. That's going to be kind of the standard that's going to be looked to, whether employers are going to be able to make the decision to stop an employee from working from home after the threat of COVID goes away. Some other questions that we have here, allowing accommodations during remote work and whether the ADA allows employers to require employees to stay at home if they have symptoms of COVID-19. This is guidance from March of 2020, but it still stands today. The short answer, yes, the CDC states that employees who became ill with COVID should leave the workplace, and the ADA doesn't really interfere with employers following that guidance. So definitely that is still allowed to require employees to stay home if they have symptoms of COVID. The next point on here is whether you can administer a COVID test when evaluating an employee's presence in the workplace, whether coming back or continuing to stay. And again, yes, the ADA does require mandatory medical tests of employees be job related and consistent with business necessity. So it can't be arbitrarily applied. It has to be related to job functions and related to business needs. So you can choose to administer COVID testing to your employees before allowing them to enter back into the workplace. And periodically even determine if their presence poses a threat to others while they're at work. A little bit more guidance. It's a little bit hard to read maybe, but the question up here is when an employer requires some or all of their employees to telework because of COVID-19, or government officials require employers to shut down their facilities and have workforce telework, is the employer required to provide a teleworking employee with the same reasonable accommodation for disability under the ADA that it provides in the workplace? So it's a little bit of a summary from what we had before. As a practical matter, to sum up, and in light of the circumstances that are leading for the need to telework, we urge that employers continue to be very flexible and creative about what can be done when an employee needs a reasonable accommodation for teleworking at home. And the key to that is, again, continuing that interactive process with your employees and have those lines of dialogue staying open to see what their needs are and determining that on a case-by-case basis. Back to Jeff.
Okay, so we've got about 4 minutes. I'm going to spend 2 of them touching on this subject and then 2 of them addressing a question that we got because it's a good one. We've got a bunch of slides in here citing a bunch of statutes and laws on the concept of what we can or cannot do to regulate employees' communications on social media. Let me boil it down to the most important one, okay? As we have forced employees home and onto other methods of communication than the water cooler or standing in the break room, what we are seeing across the board is employees are either using internal company networks to talk about things socially. They're using our email to communicate with each other socially, or they're forming groups on whatever platform you want, whether it's Instagram or other things. And sometimes that speech is overlapping with the workplace. And we see a desire to regulate it, okay? We need to be very, very cautious. There are a couple of sort of rifle shot California statutes that protect certain types of topics like wages. But the biggie is the National Labor Relations Act. That's where we're seeing the litigation. If you've got a union in place, you know exactly what the National Labor Relations Act is, and you know probably more than you would like about the National Labor Relations Board, which is the federal agency that enforces the act. They have taken the position that the rights under the National Labor Relations Act don't belong to unions, they belong to employees. That means even if your employees are not in a union, the act still protects them. Why do we care? Because the act protects any employee who is engaging in concerted activity. That's the magic language, concerted activity. That means if two employees jump on to any social media platform and start sending messages back and forth about their boss or about gee whiz, I didn't get hazard pay, everybody else is getting hazard pay, I should get it, anything to do with the workplace, that is arguably protected. Even if it verges over into violating your anti-harassment policy, if they're calling their supervisor bad names on Twitter, and you go after them for it, that arguably will violate the National Labor Relations Act. And that triggers injunctive relief and people coming out and auditing you and your policies. It's just a bad road to go down. So what we need to do is create, once again, affirmative policies. If we have a real reason for telling somebody not to bully others on Twitter, say, or bully other employees or put up racist imagery on their social media, that's all legitimate. We can enforce that. What we cannot do is clamp down on disparagement or criticism or anything that looks like a legitimate conversation about workplace complaints, including management and wage and hour levels and things like that. So you can thumb through these slides, but it really is amazing how aggressive the National Labor Relations Board is being about protecting employee speech that takes place on social media platforms, even if it might reflect badly on the employer. I want to jump to the question because it reads like a law school question. This will be our last topic for today. If we, and this has to deal with the expense reimbursement. If we provide a hotspot for security purposes, but then change our technology that we still give them a hotspot, but say it's okay to use their personal internet for faster as we have enhanced security for other means. By us saying it is okay to use their personal internet, even though we provide them a hotspot for backup, would we need to pay for the internet? Okay, that brings a whole bunch of issues together. So number one, under 2802, the definition is reasonably incurred. Well, anybody can say, I've got a better computer, a better desk, a better pen, whatever, okay? If we're providing them with access, and that's what's necessary to do the job, we do not need to go out and pay just because they want the Cadillac access plan instead of something else. So short law school answer to your question is no, okay? You don't have to pay them. The tweaks or the little complications here is what we're providing really fast enough. We've seen some glitches just on this presentation here that maybe we need to upgrade it. If somebody needs to upgrade a little bit in order to do their job, maybe that is reasonably incurred and we'd have to pay it, okay? Allowing them to use their own personal internet now exposes us to a whole host of security issues. It sounds like that's why we got into giving them the hotspot in the first place. So we're gonna have to have a whole policy about what they can or cannot do, what devices have to be there, what we do to protect our own internal firewalls and security. So now you're going to have to deal with that whole can of worms as well. So there's a lot of complications raised by this, but bottom line, if I'm providing something that is reasonably adequate for the employee to do their job and they just want better tools, do I have to pay for them? No, I don't. I can provide what I think is sufficient. Okay, I think we have reached the end of our time. My apologies very much for the technological glitches that occurred there. We will try to make all this information, of course, accessible on a distribution, written distribution here, and welcome any questions that anybody wants to send our way after getting that.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Sharon, for taking the time to present to us. You always have fantastic information. I'm going to hand it over to Mike Agresti to close out.
Yeah, so thanks, Jill. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next time. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.